Tonight, we're not just talking about history. We're stepping into a moment so brutal, so intentionally designed, that it still rattles through the centuries like a scream trapped in stone. This is the story of a man they didn't just want to kill. They wanted to erase. William Wallace. You've heard the name, maybe from a movie, maybe from a statue. But what happened to him on a gray morning in medieval London wasn't about heroism. It wasn't even about punishment. It was a message, carved into living flesh. And the worst part, it almost worked. Because Wallace wasn't just executed, he was dismantled, psychologically, symbolically, and publicly, in a ritual so cruel, so deliberately choreographed, it stopped being justice and became theater. This wasn't about rebellion. It was about control. And yet, what survived wasn't the ropes or the fire, but the defiance. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to hear the stories they tried to silence. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's disappear into the shadows of medieval power, together. You're in Scotland. August 1305. It's not raining, which feels suspicious. The hills are green, but they're holding their breath. Something's off. You're in a small village, and the gossip is dense in the air like chimney smoke. William Wallace has been captured. The man, the myth, the absolute nightmare of English logistics. Gone. No swords, no standoff. Just vanished. Word is he was handed over by John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who suddenly remembered which side his bread was buttered on. A quiet betrayal, behind a quiet door, with a quiet shake of the head. Wallace didn't scream, didn't fight. He knew this day might come. You can almost picture the moment. A flicker of recognition, a heavy exhale, and the clink of shackles that feel heavier than they should. And just like that, Scotland exhales too, but not in relief, more like resignation. You can taste it in the air. Wallace was more than a warrior. He was a weather system. And now the sky feels off. Back in London, there's buzz, not excitement. Not yet. Just the nervous tingle of empire watching a problem finally collapse into custody. Imagine a city that can barely keep track of its own filth suddenly scheduling a high-stakes, slow-burn political theater. Wallace is bound, blindfolded, and packed like a cursed relic. His journey south is long and strategically awful. There are no royal carriages here, just a man tied like a sack of potatoes, being escorted with more smugness than security. Weird fact for the night. Medieval English roads. Basically obstacle courses made of mud, bones, and horse disasters. And Wallace isn't riding in style. He's likely tied to a horse, barefoot, back cramping, neck blistered from ropes that don't know how to be gentle. At every stop, people gather, not because they want justice, but because they want a show. He's not William Wallace anymore. He's Exhibit A in a live demonstration called Don't Even Think About It. Historians still debate whether Wallace was actually given any food or water during this trip. Some think he was force-marched with only enough sustenance to keep him conscious. Others suggest he was outright starved. Either way, this wasn't transportation. It was erasure in motion. You pass through towns that treat him like a cursed mascot. People shout things, some spit, some laugh. You wonder if anyone flinches at the smell. Not of Wallace, necessarily, but of the English fear thinly disguised as righteousness. Every mile is designed to chip away at something, his pride, his spirit, maybe even his memory. They're not just moving him, they're softening him for the knife. It's hard not to imagine the irony. Wallace, who once outsmarted entire garrisons, now the star of a parade he never asked for. The man who won Stirling Bridge, who turned guerrilla warfare into an art form, is now being treated like a rabid animal the kingdom finally caught in its teeth. He's silent. Maybe meditating. Maybe dissociating. Maybe counting every second because that's the only thing they haven't taken yet. If you lean in close, really close, you might hear the wind whisper something low and ancient. How quickly a symbol can be turned into a cautionary tale. And still, the procession drags on. Hours become days. Ropes leave permanent impressions. Knees go numb. But the worst part is the stillness. Wallace can feel himself becoming background noise in a narrative he used to own. There's no cinematic music, no rebels charging over hills, just flies, sweat, and the gnawing feeling that history isn't written by the victors. It's commissioned by their publicists. Eventually, the horizon changes. London comes into view. It doesn't welcome him. It consumes him. The air here feels thicker. The walls stare back, and somewhere inside the city, a scaffold waits. But it's not just a wooden platform. It's a thesis statement. As we journey deeper into the realm of medieval mermaid tales, we'll see just how thoroughly these creatures became intertwined with life at sea and life on land. Picture this. You're a medieval merchant preparing to set sail across the unpredictable waters of the North Sea. The air is damp, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the hull seems to echo in your bones. In the back of your mind, somewhere between the excitement of new trade and the anxiety of venturing into the unknown, lurks the possibility of encountering a mermaid. But how could such a being possibly fit into the very real world of trade and travel? The answer, of course, is that mermaids didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were woven into the very fabric of medieval life through folklore, religion, and the cultural practices of the time. For instance, the Vikings, those fearless seafarers of the North, had their own version of the mermaid myth, though they often depicted them as fierce and powerful, rather than passive and beautiful. These tales weren't mere stories to pass the time. They were warnings, explanations, and even guides for surviving the treacherous waters. Mermaids were seen by many as symbols of nature's forces, both beautiful and dangerous. It wasn't just their appearance that captured the imagination, but the very act of their existence. These were creatures that straddled two worlds, the land and the sea. Their bodies were often portrayed as an uncanny hybrid, human from the waist up, but fish-like from the waist down. Such beings embodied the unknowable, the dangerous, and the mysterious. Historians still argue whether these creatures were meant to embody feminine ideals of beauty or serve as an ominous reminder of the unpredictable nature of the ocean itself. One thing is for sure, however, mermaids weren't just for sailors. They found their way into royal courts, far-flung villages, and everyday life through storytelling, art, and literature. Speaking of which, you can imagine that for those living far from the coasts, mermaids became a kind of exotic fascination. Medieval storytellers would often embellish their accounts of encounters with these sea creatures, making them appear far more human than anything seen in the real world. The stories spread like wildfire, carried by traders, monks, and pilgrims who found themselves weaving tales about their encounters on the open sea. As we dive into this story, it becomes clear that mermaids weren't confined to the misty shores of the north. They began to appear in stories all across Europe. But what's perhaps most fascinating is how the mermaid myth gradually transformed. Take the British Isles, for instance. By the time the 12th century rolled around, sightings of mermaids had been incorporated into the chronicles of the time. Some described as simple creatures who would sing to passing ships, while others portrayed them as far more sinister beings. The idea of mermaids singing their enchanting songs, luring sailors into dangerous waters, had long been a motif in folklore. But medieval Europe added a twist. A mermaid wasn't always an enemy. Some were even believed to be protectors, guiding ships safely through storms. Historians still debate whether these sightings were merely exaggerated stories told by exhausted sailors, or if there was something more to these mysterious encounters. Did they simply misinterpret the sight of seals or other marine animals? Or was there truly something supernatural lurking beneath the waves? In any case, the question of whether mermaids were benevolent or malevolent persisted through the centuries. Some medieval sailors truly believed that mermaids were to be feared, that their appearance could signal an impending disaster. Others saw them as omens of good fortune, guiding lost souls back to safety. Either way, the sea's vastness and danger only added to the mystique of these legendary creatures, making their appearances all the more tantalizing. But let's not forget that mermaids weren't merely a product of the sailors' tales. They crept into the world of medieval art and literature as well. With their alluring beauty and duality, they became popular subjects for artists. Early medieval artists tended to depict mermaids in a more abstract religious manner, often as symbols of temptation or danger, much like the sirens of old. But by the late Middle Ages, things began to shift. Artists began portraying mermaids with more human features, their bodies growing more symmetrical, and their faces softer, perhaps a reflection of the growing romanticism of the time. One famous early depiction of a mermaid comes from a manuscript dating to the 12th century. The image is surprisingly modern-looking. There's a woman with a long, flowing mane, her top half naked, her tail coiled beneath her. She's sitting on a rock, combing her hair, a serene expression on her face as though waiting for something, or someone. Historians still argue whether this figure was intended to convey sensuality or whether it was meant as a more practical warning. A mermaid who lures sailors to their doom is as much a cautionary tale as a symbol of beauty. But even these depictions began to evolve. By the time of the 14th century, mermaids were no longer just feared creatures. They were something more complex, more relatable. You could say they started to embody a human quality, the ability to straddle two worlds, much like the people who lived along the shorelines, who depended on both the land and the sea for survival. So how did medieval society continue to grapple with these half-woman, half-fish beings as their legends spread? Was there a hidden message in these stories? Maybe mermaids were a way of explaining the deep unknowns of the natural world, the vastness of the sea, the unpredictability of life itself. Or maybe, just maybe, mermaids were a reflection of a time when the lines between the known and the unknown were still so blurry, still so easily tangled. As we continue to explore the evolution of the medieval mermaid, let's shift our focus to the fascinating intersection of myth and reality. Imagine once again that you are a medieval traveler, but this time, instead of crossing the North Sea, you're heading out to the Mediterranean. The sun is blazing down on you, and the distant hum of the sea mingles with the creaking of your ship's timbers. You're about to hear a tale that will either chill your bones or make you question the mysteries of the sea. Mermaids, it seems, had a way of crossing borders, both geographical and cultural. As the myth began to spread throughout Europe, it took on new shapes and meanings depending on where it was told. The French, for example, began weaving the image of the mermaid into their stories during the 12th century. French medieval texts often described mermaids as somewhat tragic figures, lost between two worlds, unable to find peace. There was something almost melancholic about their plight, a reflection of the larger theme of the medieval worldview, the constant struggle between salvation and temptation. Historians still debate whether this shift in tone was a result of changing religious and cultural influences, or if it was simply an extension of the way mermaids had always been viewed, as creatures of dual nature. The idea of a being who could navigate both the human world and the watery depths must have resonated deeply with medieval society, where boundaries were often blurred between good and evil, life and death, the natural and the supernatural. These creatures were never just fish women. They were an embodiment of a much larger mystery, a question that medieval thinkers still struggled to answer. What lies beneath the surface? But while mermaids were growing more complex in their depiction, so too were the actual encounters people claimed to have had with them. Mermaids were no longer just mythical creatures of the deep. They were being seen more and more frequently by sailors and seafarers across Europe. This was particularly true during the 14th and 15th centuries, when an increasing number of maritime expeditions were setting out to explore the far reaches of the globe. It's no surprise that mermaids began to pop up in reports from sailors who had ventured out to unknown parts of the world. After all, when you're a sailor on a long voyage, isolated from land, surrounded by the vast, ever-changing sea, your mind is bound to wander. Add a bit of fatigue, perhaps a touch of seasickness, and maybe some overactive imagination, and it's easy to see how a chance sighting of a seal or manatee might be misinterpreted as a mermaid. Some sailors, for instance, reported seeing mermaids basking on rocks near the shorelines of Iceland or the coast of Norway. These mermaids were often described as having a human upper body with long, flowing hair, but with the unmistakable tail of a fish. But was it just imagination? Or were these accounts more than mere exaggerations? Historians are still divided on this point. While some believe that mermaid sightings were nothing more than the result of sailors misinterpreting natural phenomena, others argue that these reports might reflect something deeper, something about human nature and the yearning for the unknown. Some scholars even propose that the mermaid myth could have been a form of collective psychological projection, a way for sailors to give shape to the fear and uncertainty they felt about the ocean itself. Whatever the truth may be, these stories were taken very seriously in the medieval period. A particularly famous account comes from the court of King Henry II of England in the 12th century. According to reports, a mermaid was brought before the king after being captured by fishermen off the coast of Ireland. The creature was described as having the body of a woman with a fish's tail, and her eyes were said to be wide and tear-filled. The fishermen claimed they had found her stranded on the shore, and, as the tale goes, they presented her to the king as a wonder to behold. The king, understandably intrigued, ordered that the creature be examined. However, after a series of investigations, the court physicians declared that she was indeed a strange, perhaps diseased human who had been deformed by some form of ailment. But even then, the idea of a mermaid, whether real or not, held a place of awe and fascination. It wasn't just a simple animal or a random curiosity. It was a being that didn't quite belong in any known category. And that, in itself, made the idea of mermaids so irresistible. As we move forward in time, we see mermaids begin to take on even more magical qualities. Their connection to the supernatural deepened, and so did their association with otherworldly forces. In the same way that medieval people viewed many natural phenomena as being infused with divine or demonic power, mermaids were often seen as having control over the elements, particularly water. Water was a vital resource, but also one that could easily turn deadly. Just like the mysterious tides and storms that could sink a ship in a matter of minutes, mermaids symbolized the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. In literature, especially in the works of medieval poets and storytellers, mermaids began to evolve into symbols of beauty, tragedy, and the inexplicable forces of nature. They were no longer just terrifying temptresses or warnings to seafarers. They had become symbols of a deeper longing, perhaps for freedom, perhaps for connection to something beyond the mundane. This shift wasn't just about the mermaids themselves. It reflected a larger change in how medieval people were beginning to view their relationship with the sea. It was no longer just about survival. It was also about understanding and integrating the mysteries that came with the great unknown. Historians still debate whether this romanticization of the mermaid in literature was a reflection of a broader cultural shift, or if it was simply a result of the growing literary tradition of the time. Regardless, the mermaid's place in medieval folklore became increasingly intertwined with the human desire to make sense of the sea, and by extension, the forces of nature that shaped everyday life. As we move further into the world of medieval mermaids, it's time to take a closer look at how these creatures were viewed by those who lived far from the sea. Imagine yourself living in a small village nestled inland, where the only thing you know about the ocean comes from tales told by travelers or merchants who've made their way across the water. The idea of a creature with the body of a woman and the tail of a fish seems utterly foreign, yet still, you can't help but wonder if there might be some truth to the rumors. Mermaids, much like other creatures of folklore, weren't just confined to the coastal regions. As their legends spread, they made their way inland through the tales of wandering minstrels, travelers, and monks. And while you might not think of mermaids as being a part of daily life for people living inland, they became just as pervasive in the stories and legends of medieval Europe as they were for seafarers. In fact, one of the most fascinating aspects of the mermaid myth in medieval society is how it traveled. Thanks to the rise of written texts and the growth of universities, stories of mermaids were preserved and passed on to people who may never have seen the sea. The word-of-mouth tradition was still alive and well, but it was the written word, whether through chronicles, religious texts, or literature, that allowed the myth of the mermaid to transcend the coasts and become a pan-European phenomenon. Medieval monks were especially important in preserving and spreading these legends. As scholars, they had access to texts from the ancient world, and as they translated these works into Latin, they kept alive not only the stories of the Greeks and Romans, but also the supernatural creatures that appeared in these stories. It was through these translations that the idea of the mermaid as a hybrid creature, part human, part fish, began to take on its more familiar form. But more than that, the Church's involvement in preserving such stories also shaped how mermaids were understood. Historians still argue whether the Church's view of mermaids was purely negative or more nuanced. On one hand, the mermaid was seen as a temptation, a danger to the soul. Her seductive songs were often compared to the allure of sin, and she was thought to embody the constant pull of earthly desires away from the divine. But on the other hand, mermaids were also associated with the power of water, and water had a spiritual significance in Christianity. Water was the element of baptism and purification, but it could also be the element of destruction, as evidenced by the biblical flood. This dual nature of water mirrored the dual nature of the mermaid, alluring and dangerous, both beautiful and perilous. In much of the medieval art of the time, mermaids were depicted as strange and otherworldly, often with exaggerated features. Their long hair, for example, became a prominent part of their image. This wasn't just a detail for aesthetic purposes. Hair in medieval culture was often seen as a symbol of both virtue and temptation. A woman's hair could signify her purity and modesty, or it could suggest something far more dangerous, a way of luring a man to his doom. In the case of the mermaid, this symbolism became all the more potent. Her long, flowing hair wasn't just beautiful, it was a weapon, a tool of seduction. In some depictions, mermaids were shown combing their hair while sitting on a rock by the shore, their faces serene, almost angelic. But in others, their expressions were far more sinister, their eyes large and hollow, their features contorted in a way that made them seem both human and monstrous. These images were a reflection of the ambivalence with which mermaids were viewed. They were both natural and supernatural, earthly and divine, benign and dangerous, all at once. Interestingly, mermaids also began to appear in some of the more elaborate works of medieval literature. In the 12th century, a Latin poem known as Mermaid was written by the poet Hugh of St. Victor. This work described the mermaid as both a symbol of beauty and a warning against indulgence. The poem spoke of the mermaid's enchanting beauty, her voice that could lure men to their doom, and her role as a figure of temptation. This was one of the earliest examples of a literary work that portrayed the mermaid in a more moralistic light. The idea of mermaids as cautionary figures was not limited to religious or poetic works. It also appeared in medieval bestiaries, which were books that catalogued various animals, real and imaginary, often accompanied by moral lessons. In some of these bestiaries, mermaids were described as dangerous creatures, full of temptation, whose very existence served as a reminder of the dangers of the world. Their stories, like those of other mythical creatures, were often meant to instruct as much as they entertained, reminding the audience of the dangers that lay both in the world and within themselves. But despite their association with temptation, mermaids also held a certain allure. They were the creatures of the unknown, living in a world beyond human comprehension, at the edge of both the land and the sea. They were mysterious, and that mystery only added to their power. It's no wonder, then, that mermaids continued to hold a place in the collective imagination of medieval Europe. They were part of a larger tradition of mythical creatures, griffins, dragons, unicorns, that blurred the lines between the natural world and the supernatural, between reality and fantasy. So, as you settle into bed tonight, drifting into sleep, remember that mermaids weren't just fairy tale creatures. They were a product of a time when the unknown was more terrifying and more fascinating than ever before. They served as symbols of the dangerous beauty of the world, a reminder that just beneath the surface there are mysteries waiting to be uncovered. As the medieval fascination with mermaids continued to flourish, their roles began to take on new and even more symbolic meanings. Imagine you're in a small, candle-lit chapel, the flickering shadows dancing on the stone walls as a priest reads aloud from a well-worn text. The story being told tonight, one that's haunted the pages of medieval literature for centuries, is about a strange creature, half woman, half fish, who tempts men, lures them into the depths, and then disappears beneath the waves. But there's more to this creature than just a myth. She represents something deeper, something troubling, something that speaks to the fears and desires of the time. Mermaids, despite their portrayal as both seductive and dangerous, were also creatures that embodied the unknown in a deeply spiritual sense. The medieval worldview was deeply shaped by Christian doctrine, and water, often associated with baptism, purity, and the divine, held a powerful place in this belief system. But water was also a force of destruction, as seen in the Great Flood, which had wiped out the sinful world in the Bible. In this context, mermaids became creatures that walked the line between the sacred and the profane. Historians still debate whether mermaids were truly seen as divine figures or as symbols of sin. Some argue that the mermaid was seen as a manifestation of temptation, an idealized version of the dangers of lust and desire. After all, the allure of a beautiful woman with a song that could capture the soul was a potent symbol. Others, however, suggest that mermaids were meant to represent something more mysterious, perhaps a reflection of the fear and awe that the untamed forces of nature, embodied by the sea, inspired in the medieval mind. After all, much like the sea itself, mermaids were both nurturing and perilous, symbols of the fine balance between life and death. One of the most fascinating aspects of these mermaid legends is how they were perceived by different groups in society. For the religious scholars and clerics, the mermaid was almost certainly a symbol of temptation. She was a siren, meant to lead men astray, to drown them in sin, to lure them away from the path of righteousness. This connection between mermaids and sin became especially pronounced during the medieval period, when the Catholic Church's focus on sin and salvation was at its height. The mermaid's association with temptation is most famously represented by the mermaid from the biblical text, particularly in some early Christian texts, where she was depicted as the epitome of earthly pleasure and sin. The Church's teaching often likened the mermaid to a dangerous female figure, much like the mythological sirens of ancient Greece, whose songs could lead sailors to their doom. However, there was another side to the mermaid myth, one that was more mysterious and less tied to sin. As we move beyond the religious interpretations, we see mermaids beginning to take on more ambiguous roles. The medieval period was one of great exploration, and with it came a growing fascination with the natural world and the unknown. Sea voyages were becoming longer and more frequent, and the idea of encountering strange creatures at the edge of the known world began to captivate the imagination. Mermaids, in this context, were no longer simply symbols of danger. They were also part of the larger exploration of the natural world, where creatures like sea serpents, giant fish, and unknown aquatic beings were often mentioned in the same breath. Just as sailors and explorers in the Middle Ages encountered strange lands and unfamiliar peoples, they also encountered strange sea creatures. Whether the reports of mermaid sightings were real or exaggerated, they contributed to the broader narrative of discovery. But it wasn't just sailors who were captivated by the idea of mermaids. They began to appear in the artwork of the time as well, with some of the earliest depictions of mermaids appearing in religious and royal manuscripts. These depictions often showed mermaids in their duality, beautiful yet dangerous, serene yet wild. In many cases, these mermaids were shown as part of the natural world, interacting with other creatures in a peaceful or harmonious manner. They were portrayed in a way that suggested they were not simply monsters or seductresses, but creatures whose connection to the sea gave them an inherent mystery. In one particularly notable example from the 14th century, a manuscript from a French monastery depicts a mermaid combing her hair while sitting on a rock by the sea. The image, delicate and serene, emphasizes the mermaid's beauty and calm, rather than her potential to cause harm. In this way, mermaids were also incorporated into the broader cultural narratives of beauty and grace, reflecting a time when human desires were beginning to be explored in more complex ways. While mermaids were increasingly romanticized in this period, they still maintained their dangerous allure. Stories continued to circulate, and even in some of the most prominent royal courts, there was a growing fascination with these creatures. Merchants, explorers, and even noblemen would bring back tales of mermaid sightings, which were often met with awe and curiosity. These stories, whether true or not, contributed to the belief that mermaids were real, existing somewhere on the fringes of the known world, waiting to be discovered. But here's the most curious part. These tales of mermaids didn't just disappear. Despite the scientific advancements of the Renaissance and the increasing skepticism that began to take hold, stories of mermaids continued to pop up well into the early modern period. People remained fascinated by the possibility that such creatures could exist, and the allure of the mermaid as both a figure of beauty and danger persisted. So, as you let these medieval tales of mermaids settle into your mind, remember that these creatures weren't just part of ancient superstitions. They were living, breathing figures in the cultural landscape of the time, occupying a space between myth and reality. The mystery of mermaids, both then and now, speaks to our eternal fascination with what lies just beyond the edge of the known world, hiding in the depths. As we continue to explore the deep waters of medieval mermaid mythology, it's time to turn our attention to how these fascinating creatures were seen by those who spent their lives on the ocean. Imagine the scene. A creaking wooden ship slicing through the cold, fog-laden waters of the North Sea. You've been out at sea for months, and the air is heavy with salt and the smell of the unknown. The sea is both beautiful and terrifying, a vast expanse of water that seems to stretch on forever. And then, just as you think you're starting to understand it, a sight appears, one that defies all logic. A mermaid, gliding effortlessly through the waves. To sailors, the mermaid was not just a mythical creature. She was an omen, a symbol of the sea's mystery and danger. Many sailors reported seeing these half-woman, half-fish beings during their long voyages. Sometimes they were said to appear from nowhere, their pale faces peering out from the water, beckoning with song or silence. Sometimes they were seen basking on the rocks, combing their long hair as if they had all the time in the world. The sailors, who had already witnessed the most terrifying storms and monstrous creatures, were left to wonder. Were these mermaids a sign of doom, or were they merely the sea's way of reminding them of the unknown? Historians still argue about the nature of these encounters. Were they true sightings of creatures yet to be discovered? Or were they simply products of overactive imaginations, compounded by months of isolation and a life spent at sea? Some scholars suggest that the confusion could have come from misidentifications of other marine creatures, such as manatees or seals, whose bodies might have appeared similar to the half-human, half-fish image of the mermaid. Others propose that mermaid sightings were a type of psychological phenomenon, a result of the loneliness and fatigue of sailors who, far from home, began to see what they wanted, or feared, to see. Nevertheless, the mermaid sightings continued to surface throughout the medieval period. and they were often described in vivid, sometimes eerie detail. Take, for example, the famous account of a mermaid sighting off the coast of Ireland in the 12th century. According to the tale, a fisherman spotted a strange figure emerging from the water, a creature with the head and torso of a woman, but the tail of a fish. As the mermaid made eye contact with the fisherman, she let out a mournful cry before disappearing beneath the waves. The fisherman, stunned by the encounter, rushed to tell his fellow villagers, but many dismissed his story as a figment of his imagination. Still, the legend persisted, growing with each retelling. Then there was the infamous sighting of a mermaid in 1403, reported by a group of sailors near the coast of Scotland. This mermaid, they claimed, was seen playing in the surf, her long hair swirling in the water. When the sailors attempted to approach her, she vanished with a flick of her tail, leaving only ripples behind. The sailors, both terrified and mesmerized, swore that what they had seen was no mere figment of the imagination. This particular story, unlike many others, was not dismissed as a tall tale. The idea of a mermaid encounter had grown so widespread by this time that even some of the most skeptical sailors were starting to believe that something, perhaps, was lurking beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether these sightings were simply embellishments or whether they reflected a genuine belief in the supernatural. Perhaps the mermaid sightings were a product of a time when the unknown was magnified, when the sea was seen as a vast, mysterious force that could not be fully understood. But there was something about these sightings, something deeply captivating, that allowed the mermaid to endure in the collective imagination of Europe. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to straddle two worlds, both human and fish, land and sea, a symbol of the mysteries that lay beyond the horizon. In fact, the very nature of mermaids' dual existence made them powerful symbols for medieval people. They were not just creatures of the sea. They embodied the tension between the known and the unknown, the real and the imagined. This duality made them figures of fascination, both in their beauty and their danger. Like the sea itself, they were unpredictable and unknowable, and that made them all the more compelling. Of course, the mermaid myth wasn't just limited to sailors and fishermen. The allure of these strange sea creatures began to spread beyond the coastlines and into the halls of power and influence. Kings and queens, courtiers and nobles, all became enchanted by the idea of mermaids. In fact, one of the most famous stories of a royal mermaid encounter comes from the court of King Henry II of England. According to the tale, a mermaid was captured off the coast of Ireland and brought before the king. Her strange appearance, part woman, part fish, caused a stir among the court, and she was paraded around like a rare spectacle. But despite her otherworldly beauty, she was eventually determined to be a mere curiosity, a creature not of divine origin, but one of the sea's strange inhabitants. Still, the mermaid's presence at the court of Henry II contributed to the idea that these creatures were more than just myths. They were, in some sense, real. Historians still argue whether these royal encounters with mermaids were based in truth or simply legends that had grown too large to dismiss. The idea of a mermaid in the royal court is both a symbol of the sea's mystery and a reminder of the power of myth. These creatures, part woman, part fish, represented the thin line between reality and fantasy that was so prevalent in medieval thought. The mermaid was both a marvel and a warning, an enigma that challenged the boundaries of knowledge and understanding. But what is perhaps most telling about these mermaid encounters is not just their ability to capture the imagination, but how they reflect the medieval mindset. In a world that was still trying to make sense of the vast and unpredictable forces of nature, the mermaid became a symbol of the unknown. Whether she was seen as a threat or a guide, a siren or a savior, the mermaid remained a figure of fascination, a creature that existed at the edge of the world, just beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered. As the medieval world turned its gaze toward the unknown, the idea of the mermaid began to shift once again. You've likely heard the phrase, "Don't judge a book by its cover." And in many ways, this saying could apply to the evolving perception of mermaids during this time. They were no longer just creatures to be feared or admired for their beauty. As the stories continued to circulate, they became more complex, more human, in fact. They began to take on new roles within the medieval imagination, becoming more than just seductive symbols of the sea. Let's imagine for a moment that you're a traveler, walking along the streets of a bustling medieval town. The sun is setting, and the air is heavy with the scent of spices, freshly baked bread, and the hum of conversation. You overhear two merchants discussing an incredible sighting they've just had while crossing the Mediterranean. One describes a creature with the body of a woman and the tail of a fish, her beauty like nothing they had ever seen before. But there's something else in his voice, an element of awe, even reverence. The other merchant is skeptical but intrigued, pressing for more details. These tales, once dismissed as the ramblings of the superstitious, now seem to be gaining some credibility. Historians still debate why mermaids took on such a dual nature in medieval times. Was it because they were inherently connected to water, an element that could both sustain life and destroy it? Or was it simply that mermaids, like many mythical creatures, reflected the larger tensions of the medieval period? Perhaps they symbolized the ever-present pull between the spiritual and the material, between temptation and salvation. Either way, they became more than just dangerous, half-human creatures. They began to be seen as metaphors for something deeper, something about the balance of life and death, desire and virtue. One interesting shift in mermaid lore during the medieval period was how they were incorporated into the religious narrative. While many Christian scholars and clergy regarded mermaids as symbols of temptation, others saw them in a more positive light, if not as actual creatures, then as symbols of divine intervention or spiritual lessons. Water, as we've seen, had a profound connection to Christian rites, such as baptism, and was often seen as both a purifier and a medium for the miraculous. This made mermaids, who straddled the line between the human and the divine, a fascinating subject for interpretation. In some cases, mermaids began to be portrayed as more angelic figures, their beauty not just a physical allure, but a symbol of something higher, a representation of the divine mysteries of the ocean. Some of these depictions came from a reinterpretation of earlier myths, where the mermaid's song no longer led to destruction, but instead guided souls toward salvation or enlightenment. This view transformed mermaids into beings that were not just vessels of temptation, but figures capable of transcendent beauty and grace. On the other hand, the darker interpretations of mermaids didn't disappear. As Christianity became more deeply entrenched in European culture, the belief that mermaids were dangerous symbols of temptation persisted, and they were frequently linked to witchcraft. The image of the mermaid as a seductive, dangerous creature played well into the larger narrative of medieval fear of witches and their alleged power over men. It's no surprise that during the height of the witch trials, some mermaids were painted as evil, demonic figures, beings who could turn men's hearts to sin and lead them away from the Christian path. Mermaids were also seen as creatures who lived on the edges of the known world, which made them the perfect subjects for stories of the supernatural and the mysterious. For a time, it was believed that mermaids, along with other strange sea creatures, inhabited remote islands or distant shores, places that were difficult to reach and often associated with the unknown. These myths helped reinforce the notion that the further one traveled into the unknown, the more likely it was that they would encounter supernatural forces. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, mermaids began to appear less frequently in the writings and religious works of Europe, as Renaissance thinkers turned their attention to more scientific explanations for the unknown. But even as belief in mermaids waned, the myths surrounding them lived on, passed down through folk stories and artistic representations. By the time the Renaissance fully took hold, mermaids had evolved from fearsome, seductive creatures into something more akin to the enchanting figures we recognize today in popular culture. It's interesting to consider how the mermaid myth survived into the early modern period, despite the increasing emphasis on reason and scientific inquiry. After all, as ships sailed further and farther into the world, the discoveries of new lands and new creatures could have easily replaced mermaids as the ultimate symbol of the unknown. But instead, the mermaid persisted, her beauty, mystery, and dual nature making her an enduring figure in the cultural consciousness. Historians still wonder why this myth remained so persistent. Perhaps the mermaid represented something about humanity's desire to reconcile the spiritual and the earthly, the human and the otherworldly. She was both a reflection of the human fascination with the sea, with its beauty and danger, and a symbol of the human struggle to understand forces beyond our control. She was more than just a tale to tell by the fire. She was a figure that had been shaped by centuries of cultural exchange, religious thought, and the timeless human quest for meaning in a world filled with mystery. So, as we settle into the final chapters of this journey, think about the mermaid's place in the world. She was once a symbol of temptation, an omen of disaster, a warning for those who dared to venture too far from the shore. But over time, she became a symbol of something far more enduring, the human desire to understand the unknown, to connect with the mysteries of nature, and to see the world through a lens of wonder and curiosity. As we turn the page in our exploration of medieval mermaids, let's take a step back and reflect on just how deeply these sea creatures became embedded in the cultural psyche. Imagine the scene. You're in a bustling medieval town square, where traders from all over Europe are selling their wares, and children run about, laughing and playing. As the market quiets down for the evening, an elderly woman gathers a group of eager listeners to tell them a story of a mermaid. The tale is not about the usual seductive temptress or dangerous siren. No, this mermaid is a more tragic figure, a reflection of the duality that defines so much of medieval thinking. As the story unfolds, the mermaid's plight becomes more than just a tale of the sea. It is a cautionary allegory about the complex human condition, a reminder of the tensions between earthly desires and divine aspirations. Throughout medieval Europe, mermaids were not only seen as supernatural beings, but also as symbols of the deep existential struggles that people faced. They were caught between two worlds, like the people who lived on the edges of the known world, always straddling the line between the familiar and the unknown. In many ways, they mirrored the human condition itself, drawn between the forces of good and evil, between the desires of the flesh and the calls of the divine. Historians still debate whether these depictions were intended to inspire fear or empathy, but one thing is clear: mermaids were far more than just mysterious creatures. They were deeply intertwined with the medieval understanding of the world's complexities, serving as symbols of temptation, duality, and the struggle between earthly pleasures and spiritual salvation. Interestingly, as we move from the 12th century into the 14th and 15th centuries, the stories surrounding mermaids begin to show more of this dual nature. They are no longer simply seen as dangerous or alluring, but as creatures whose existence is a paradox, embodying both beauty and danger. As the Church's influence over everyday life grew, so too did the moralistic tone of many mermaid stories. The mermaid's enchanting beauty and seductive allure became a powerful symbol of temptation, and her aquatic domain, the very element that sustains life, became a metaphor for the dangers that lay beneath the surface of human existence. Take, for instance, the famous tale of the Mermaid of Zenor, a small village in Cornwall. According to the legend, a young man named Matthew Trewhella, who was a choir singer at the local church, heard the sweet singing of a mermaid while walking by the sea. Mesmerized by her voice, he followed the melody until he disappeared beneath the waves, never to be seen again. The villagers believed that Matthew had been lured to his death by the mermaid's song, and the event became a well-known story in the region. Some versions of the tale even suggest that Matthew's disappearance was a form of divine retribution for his temptation to stray from his spiritual path. Historians still wonder whether this tale was meant to serve as a warning to the community about the dangers of sin and temptation. After all, the mermaid's song was not merely a beautiful sound. It was a call to abandon one's duties, to give in to earthly desires, and to forsake the divine. The story of Matthew's disappearance, much like other medieval mermaid tales, carried a deep moral lesson, one that reflected the concerns of medieval society about the fragility of the soul and the ever-present dangers of temptation. Yet, as the medieval period progressed, the mermaid myth didn't just remain a cautionary tale. It began to evolve into something more complex. As the Renaissance approached, so too did a greater sense of curiosity and exploration about the natural world. People began to look beyond the superstitions of the past and started to embrace a new era of scientific discovery. With this shift, the mermaid myth became less about the dangers of temptation and more about the mystery of nature. Mermaids, once seen as creatures of the supernatural, began to be imagined in a more naturalistic light. They became subjects for natural philosophers, who were eager to understand and categorize all living creatures, including those that existed only in myth. In fact, many early modern naturalists and explorers took great interest in mermaids, hoping to discover real evidence of such creatures in the wild. They examined everything from sea creatures like manatees and dugongs to the accounts of sailors who had witnessed mermaid-like beings. Some even speculated that mermaids might be related to ancient sea creatures, offering a connection between myth and the natural world. But despite the growing influence of science, mermaids continued to hold a place in the popular imagination. They were no longer just figures of temptation or tragedy. They became creatures of mystery and fascination, caught between the natural world and the unknown. The once seductive sirens who had called sailors to their deaths now became subjects of wonder and awe. Their allure was no longer seen solely as a destructive force. Instead, it became a symbol of nature's beauty and the eternal mystery of the sea. The fascination with mermaids didn't fade as the Renaissance turned into the early modern period. In fact, mermaids became prominent figures in literature, art, and culture, their mythical status evolving in response to the changing world around them. In some ways, they represented the eternal struggle between the known and the unknown, the natural and the supernatural, the human and the divine. Mermaids, it seems, were able to transcend the boundaries of the medieval world and continue their existence into the early modern era. But as they moved further away from the religious and moralistic context in which they had originally been conceived, they began to take on new meanings. No longer just symbols of temptation and danger, they became enduring icons of mystery, beauty, and the boundless curiosity of the human spirit. And perhaps that's the true legacy of the medieval mermaid. She represents the endless quest for understanding, the desire to make sense of the world and the forces that shape it, and the ongoing human fascination with what lies just beyond our reach. As you settle down to sleep tonight, remember that the mermaid is a creature caught between two worlds, much like us, constantly navigating the space between the known and the unknown. As we continue our deep dive into the world of medieval mermaids, we see that these enigmatic creatures played a larger role in the cultural landscape than we might expect. By now, you might be imagining the quiet shores of medieval Europe, where the sea's influence was as much a part of life as the land itself. For sailors and villagers alike, the sea was both an essential source of life and a perilous expanse that could swallow them whole. It was here, along these treacherous coasts, that mermaids, whether real or imagined, became central to stories of mystery, exploration, and the unknown. Let's pause for a moment and think about the broader context of these sightings. You're a sailor on a long voyage. The sea stretches endlessly before you, and the sky above seems to fade into the horizon. You've heard the stories, of course, the ones about mermaids who call to sailors, beckoning them with their sweet songs, leading them off course, or worse, to their deaths. And yet, when you are on the open water, surrounded by nothing but waves and sky, the sea seems almost too vast, too unpredictable, to be entirely understood. Could mermaids really exist out there, hiding beneath the waves? Or were they simply figments of a sailor's weary imagination? Historians still debate the origins of many of the mermaid sightings recorded during the medieval period. Some argue that the stories were just exaggerations, born from the minds of sailors who had been at sea for months, desperate for a sense of mystery in the midst of the endless waves. Others propose that sightings were based on encounters with marine animals like manatees, whose appearance could have been easily mistaken for a mermaid. Yet, regardless of the true origin of these sightings, the fact remains that mermaids became a part of the collective psyche, deeply embedded in the stories and superstitions of the time. In fact, the idea of mermaids was so powerful that they were not confined to the isolated corners of medieval life. They began to infiltrate the popular consciousness, appearing in not only sailors' tales, but also in the artwork, literature, and religious texts of the period. The sea, with all its wonder and danger, was increasingly seen as a place where the line between reality and myth became blurred. Mermaids, as creatures who embodied both beauty and peril, perfectly captured this duality. One of the most striking ways that mermaids appeared in medieval artwork was in the form of church art and religious manuscripts. Imagine, for a moment, a beautifully illuminated manuscript, its pages adorned with vibrant colors and intricate designs. As you flip through the pages, you encounter an image of a mermaid, her upper body gracefully human, her tail shimmering with vibrant hues, a symbol of the mystery that lay beyond the earthly realm. In this context, mermaids were often not just symbols of temptation, but of a divine paradox. The mermaid's dual nature, caught between the human and the supernatural, was a visual representation of the conflict between spiritual purity and worldly desires. But mermaids weren't just depicted in religious art. They also appeared in medieval bestiaries, which catalogued various creatures, real and imagined, from around the world. These bestiaries were often filled with strange and fantastical creatures, unicorns, dragons, and griffins, and the mermaid was no exception. In some of these texts, mermaids were presented alongside other creatures of folklore, their strange, liminal nature serving as a reminder of the wild, untamed aspects of the world that humans could not easily control. The mermaid's status as a creature of both land and sea made her an apt metaphor for the medieval imagination, constantly torn between the known and the unknown. But mermaids were also beginning to be depicted in more secular art, as the Renaissance slowly began to make its mark on medieval society. As the world started to shift towards humanism and a renewed interest in the natural world, mermaids began to take on a more romanticized and less threatening image. The dangerous, seductive figure of the mermaid was replaced by an image of grace, beauty, and even love. For example, the 15th century artist Hans Memling painted a stunning image of a mermaid reclining on a rock, her human torso glowing with ethereal light. The creature is no longer simply an agent of temptation, but a figure of enchanting allure, almost a reflection of an idealized, untouched beauty. Historians still argue whether this shift in artistic portrayal was a reflection of broader cultural changes, or whether it was part of a continued fascination with the mysteries of nature that the mermaid symbolized. One thing is clear, however. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, mermaids became less of a direct threat and more of an emblem of the complexities of the natural world. A world that, while still mysterious, was beginning to be seen through a new lens. The mermaid's transformation from a creature of peril to one of fascination mirrored the larger intellectual and cultural shifts that were taking place during this time. As the Renaissance continued, the stories of mermaids began to evolve even further. They appeared not just in works of art and literature, but also in the growing body of travel literature that emerged from the age of exploration. Explorers who journeyed to distant lands and encountered unfamiliar cultures began to report strange sightings of exotic animals, and sometimes these animals seemed to bear an uncanny resemblance to the mermaids of old. Whether these stories were rooted in truth or fantasy is difficult to say, but one thing is certain. Mermaids had found their place not just in the mythologies of medieval Europe, but in the emerging narratives of the early modern world. As the story of the mermaid continued to evolve, she began to take on a new form, a creature that existed not just in the folklore of sailors and villagers, but in the imaginations of the intellectuals and artists who sought to understand the world. This shift, though subtle, marks a turning point in how mermaids were perceived. No longer were they simply creatures of danger, lurking in the deep. They became symbols of something greater, the human desire to explore, to understand, and to uncover the mysteries of the unknown. As we move further into the unfolding story of mermaids in the medieval period, the role they played in the cultural fabric becomes even more fascinating. Imagine for a moment that you're in a bustling marketplace, the sun hanging low in the sky, as the air hums with the noise of traders shouting their wares. Amid the lively chatter, you overhear an intriguing conversation. Two merchants, one from a coastal town and the other from a far-off village, are discussing a strange creature they've both heard about: the mermaid. One of them insists that she is a harbinger of good fortune, while the other argues she is a curse that brings only disaster. Mermaids, as we've seen, were not only creatures of seduction or danger, they had a curious way of representing something more complex. They were beings that hovered between worlds, the human and the supernatural, the earthly and the divine, the known and the unknown. This ambiguity made mermaids not just figures of terror, but figures of wonder, a reminder that the boundaries between the known and the mysterious were never truly fixed. Historians still wonder whether mermaids were intended to be symbols of the unknown, creatures that embodied the fears and fascinations of a medieval society on the edge of great change. The medieval period was marked by exploration, both geographically and intellectually. As new lands were discovered, as new knowledge began to reshape the medieval worldview, the mermaid became something more than just a superstition. She became a symbol of humanity's desire to understand the natural world, to bridge the gap between the known and the unknown. As explorers traveled farther and farther from home, they began to encounter new creatures, some of which may have been misidentified as mermaids. Take, for example, the early reports from sailors who journeyed to the shores of Africa. These explorers spoke of strange half-human beings with long, flowing hair, who were said to live in the sea. These descriptions may have been exaggerations, but they reflected the excitement of discovery and the fascination with the unknown that drove much of medieval exploration. The mermaid myth had become entwined with the excitement of encountering new worlds, worlds that were just as mysterious and unpredictable as the creatures themselves. In many ways, these early reports of mermaids represented the human desire to impose meaning on the mysteries of the world. In an era when the sea was seen as a vast, dangerous force, encountering a mermaid seemed to offer an explanation, a story that made sense of the frightening and unpredictable nature of the ocean. Whether real or imagined, the mermaid provided a symbol of the unknown, a creature who straddled the boundary between land and sea, human and animal, reality and myth. But as the medieval period continued to evolve, so too did the way mermaids were perceived. They began to appear less frequently in religious texts and more often in the literature and art of the time. The Renaissance's emphasis on humanism and exploration reshaped the way mermaids were viewed. Instead of being solely symbols of temptation or peril, mermaids became more romanticized, their beauty and mystery celebrated in works of art and poetry. In this new context, the mermaid's allure wasn't just in her ability to tempt sailors, but in her embodiment of the unknown. Her dual nature became a symbol of the mysteries that lay just beyond the reach of human understanding. Take, for example, the famous works of Renaissance artists, such as the depictions of mermaids in the paintings of artists like Hans Memling. In these works, mermaids were often shown reclining on rocks, gazing serenely out at the ocean. Their human upper halves were beautifully rendered, while their tails shimmered with vibrant colors. These representations of mermaids were far removed from the dangerous, seductive figures of earlier times. Instead, they were romanticized, embodying the ideals of beauty and grace that were so central to Renaissance art. In these images, the mermaid became not just a figure of mystery and peril, but a creature of ethereal beauty, an emblem of nature's hidden wonders. Historians still debate whether this shift in portrayal was a reflection of broader cultural changes or simply a natural evolution in the way myths and folklore were depicted in art. Regardless, it is clear that by the Renaissance, mermaids had undergone a transformation. From dangerous creatures of the deep, they had become symbols of the unexplored, the mystical, and the beautiful. Their ability to occupy two worlds, human and animal, land and sea, made them both timeless and universally captivating. Their myth, in many ways, became a reflection of the ever-changing relationship between humanity and the mysteries of nature. Mermaids also began to find their way into literature in new ways. In the works of authors such as Sir Thomas Malory, who is best known for his tales of King Arthur, mermaids were often portrayed as tragic figures, caught between two worlds. They were no longer simply symbols of temptation. They became figures who struggled with their own identity, trapped between the human and the supernatural, and caught in a world that didn't quite know how to understand them. In this way, mermaids reflected the growing sense of disillusionment that came with the Renaissance's intellectual revolution. The rigid structures of medieval thought were being replaced by a more fluid, more complex understanding of the world. The mermaid, as a creature who existed between two realms, became a perfect metaphor for this shift. She represented the tension between the old and the new, the known and the unknown, the human and the divine. The more romanticized portrayals of mermaids during the Renaissance didn't completely erase the earlier, darker views of these creatures. In fact, the mermaid's dual nature remained a central theme throughout her evolving myth. The tension between beauty and danger, allure and peril, remained a constant part of her story. This duality made mermaids endlessly fascinating. They were creatures of the sea, mysterious and alluring, yet also dangerous and unpredictable. They were symbols of the unknown, a reminder that there were always forces beyond human understanding. As the Renaissance gave way to the modern era, the mermaid myth began to take on even more symbolic meanings. She would go on to evolve into the more familiar image of the enchanting, otherworldly creature we recognize today. Yet, the heart of her story, the tension between the human and the divine, the mortal and the supernatural, remained unchanged. Now that we've reached the heart of the Renaissance, where mermaids were evolving into figures of ethereal beauty, let's pause and consider the profound transformation that occurred in the way these creatures were perceived by the general public. The medieval mermaid, once seen primarily as a threat or a symbol of sin, had grown into something more complex, a creature capable of embodying both the mystery of nature and the longing for something beyond the human experience. Her beauty and danger had become intertwined with humanity's ever-growing curiosity about the natural world, the supernatural, and the infinite possibilities that lay just out of reach. As you settle into your bed tonight, imagine being part of this great shift in thinking. Picture yourself walking the cobbled streets of a Renaissance city, the air filled with the faint smell of ink and parchment, as printers and scholars work to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The world is changing rapidly. Ancient traditions are being questioned, and new discoveries are being made every day. In the midst of this cultural revolution, the figure of the mermaid takes on new roles, no longer just a creature of temptation, but also a representation of the unknown, a symbol of humanity's desire to explore the world and its mysteries. The shift in the perception of mermaids during the Renaissance wasn't just about how they were portrayed in art. It reflected the larger cultural and intellectual movements of the time. Humanism, with its emphasis on the value of human experience and the exploration of the natural world, gave rise to a fascination with creatures that bridged the gap between the earthly and the divine. Mermaids, who could exist between the realms of land and sea, human and animal, came to symbolize this tension between the known and the unknown, between human potential and the mysteries of nature. Historians still discuss whether this transformation in the mermaid myth was simply a reflection of the cultural shifts of the Renaissance. or whether it was part of a larger movement in folklore and mythology. The truth, as with many aspects of history, is probably a little of both. As the world began to embrace reason and scientific inquiry, mermaids were reinterpreted from dangerous seductresses to symbols of nature's complexity. The rise of exploration, the expansion of geographical knowledge, and the beginnings of modern science helped to change the way mermaids were viewed. The sea, once a place of terror and superstition, became a space for discovery and understanding. This new view of mermaids found expression not only in the arts, but also in the burgeoning field of natural history. As explorers began to chart distant lands and waters, they encountered new, unfamiliar creatures, some of which resembled the mermaids described in ancient myths. The most famous case of this phenomenon occurred in the 17th century, when sailors claimed to have sighted mermaids off the coast of the West Indies. These were not, of course, the mythical half-woman, half-fish creatures, but rather manatees, whose appearances led to a resurgence in mermaid reports. But in these reports, the mermaid's mystique was no longer tied to warnings about temptation or destruction. Instead, mermaids became part of the growing curiosity about the natural world. Sailors and naturalists began to study these mermaid sightings with a sense of wonder rather than fear, fueling the popular fascination with mermaids well into the modern period. As mermaids became more firmly embedded in the world of folklore, art, and natural history, they also continued to evolve as cultural symbols. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the Age of Enlightenment and the subsequent Romantic period, mermaids would come to symbolize more than just the tension between the known and the unknown. They became icons of beauty, longing, and desire, creatures who lived at the borders of human experience, symbolizing the unfulfilled desires and dreams that were central to the human condition. In works of literature, mermaids became tragic figures, often caught between the mortal world and the allure of the sea, torn between their desires and the world they could never fully belong to. In many ways, the Romantic period's reinterpretation of the mermaid reflected the growing influence of imagination, emotion, and the sublime in Western thought. As industrialization took hold and the natural world became increasingly tamed and explored, mermaids stood as symbols of the untamed, the mysterious, and the unreachable. They embodied the longing for something more, something wild and untamable, something that could never be fully understood or possessed. But as with many myths, the mermaid's journey was far from over. By the time the 19th century arrived, mermaids had undergone yet another transformation. They had become subjects of popular fiction, appearing in works like Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, where the mermaid was no longer a symbol of temptation, but rather of love, sacrifice, and tragedy. This tale, with its heart-wrenching narrative, cemented the mermaid's place in modern culture as a figure of deep emotional resonance, a symbol of the desire to transcend one's limitations and reach for something greater, even at great personal cost. Historians still debate how mermaids managed to remain such potent figures in folklore, art, and culture across centuries. How did a myth, born from the deep fears and fascinations of medieval sailors, evolve into the symbols of beauty, longing, and sacrifice that we recognize today? Perhaps it's because mermaids, in all their various forms, embody the eternal tension between the known and the unknown, the mortal and the divine, the human and the otherworldly. As we reflect on the long journey of the mermaid myth, it's clear that these creatures were not just the product of superstition or whimsy. They were deeply embedded in the human experience, They represented the mystery of the sea, the unknown forces of nature, and the human quest to understand, to explore, and to dream. Now, as you lay back and close your eyes, think about how mermaids, in all their complexity, have mirrored humanity's own journey. Like us, they have moved from the shadows of mystery to the light of understanding, from creatures of danger to symbols of beauty, longing, and hope. The mermaid, it seems, will always remain a part of us, a reflection of our deepest desires and our unending quest to make sense of the vast, mysterious world we inhabit. As we drift deeper into the legacy of the mermaid myth, let's shift focus once more, this time toward how the mermaid has come to represent something uniquely modern, even as her origins lie far back in the medieval era. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a rocky shore, gazing at the crashing waves. The horizon stretches endlessly before you, and as the wind tugs at your hair, a thought comes to mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, there's a mermaid beneath the surface. Or perhaps she's a reflection of something more profound, the desire for escape, for transcendence, for a world beyond the confines of land and time. The mermaid's journey, as we've seen, stretches from ancient myths to the fantastical tales of medieval sailors, and beyond to the vibrant imaginations of the modern world. Today, mermaids are more familiar than ever, appearing in films, books, and pop culture in ways that might seem far removed from their original, dangerous forms. Yet, at their core, they still hold the same mystery, the same allure that captured the imaginations of medieval societies so long ago. In the modern era, mermaids have shed many of their darker connotations. No longer creatures to be feared or viewed solely as symbols of temptation. They've become symbols of empowerment, freedom, and transformation. This transformation began with works like Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, but it truly reached new heights in the 20th and 21st centuries. Mermaids are now often portrayed as symbols of independence, wildness, and the unquenchable desire to break free from societal constraints. But why this shift? Why did the mermaid, once a symbol of danger and sin, become a symbol of personal empowerment and transcendence? Historians suggest that part of this change is due to the broader cultural movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. As society began to question traditional roles, particularly those of women, the image of the mermaid evolved from one of passive beauty to one of active rebellion. The mermaid, freed from the constraints of the land, became an emblem of independence, capable of both navigating the mysteries of the ocean and transcending the limitations of the human experience. In literature and film, mermaids took on new forms. Think about films like Splash, 1984, where the mermaid was a gentle, yet powerful figure who defied convention to pursue love and personal agency, or the way mermaids appear in popular culture today, in everything from The Little Mermaid to the more recent depictions in fantasy novels and movies, where they are no longer mere symbols of seduction or danger, but powerful and autonomous creatures of the sea. This transformation reflects a society's evolving views on autonomy, freedom, and identity. But even as modern depictions of mermaids embrace their strength and independence, they still hold on to their original mythological essence. After all, a mermaid is still, at her core, a creature of the sea, a place that is both alluring and dangerous. The tension between beauty and danger, allure and peril, remains intrinsic to the mermaid myth, even in modern retellings. As much as we romanticize the idea of the mermaid as a creature of power and transformation, there is still something inherently mysterious, something that speaks to the unknown, in the way she moves through the ocean's depths. She is both a reflection of our greatest desires and a reminder of the eternal mysteries that lie beyond. The mermaid's dual nature, her existence between worlds, continues to resonate with modern audiences because she embodies that same tension that exists within all of us. She is human enough to be relatable, yet otherworldly enough to embody everything we long to escape to. Her voice still calls to us, as it did for sailors long ago, tempting us with the mysteries of the unknown, the freedom of the sea, and the allure of what lies just beyond our reach. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the modern mermaid is the way she has become a symbol of environmental awareness and connection to the natural world. As humanity becomes increasingly aware of its impact on the environment, mermaids have transformed into symbols of the ocean's beauty and fragility. They are now often depicted as protectors of the sea, beings who, much like humanity, are threatened by the destruction of the natural world. The mermaid, in this sense, has come full circle. From a creature that once embodied the dangers of the sea, she has become a protector of it. She represents the delicate balance between nature and human activity, a reminder of the power we hold to destroy and the responsibility we have to protect. The modern mermaid has also become a figure of inclusivity, representing a wide range of identities and experiences. Whether it's through adaptations in popular culture that depict mermaids of different races, genders, or abilities, or through modern artistic interpretations, mermaids have come to symbolize the idea that there is no one correct way to exist in the world. Just as the sea is vast and ever-changing, so too are the identities and experiences of those who embrace the mermaid as a symbol. She is no longer a single, monolithic figure, but a diverse representation of possibility, transformation, and self-expression. This evolution from a creature of temptation to a symbol of empowerment, environmental stewardship, and inclusivity is a testament to the enduring power of the mermaid myth. The mermaid, much like the ocean she inhabits, is constantly shifting, changing, and evolving, reflecting the hopes, fears, and dreams of each generation. From the seductress of medieval tales to the independent and environmental icon of today, the mermaid's journey is far from over. She continues to inspire, captivate, and remind us of the mysteries that remain just beyond our reach. As you close your eyes tonight, think about the enduring legacy of the mermaid. From the earliest myths to the modern depictions, she has been a symbol of what lies beneath the surface, both literally and metaphorically. The mermaid remains an emblem of the unknown, a reminder that, even in our modern world, there is always more to discover, more to explore, and more to understand. As we continue our journey through the world of mermaids, it's time to dive into one of the most compelling and somewhat melancholic aspects of their mythology: the idea of the mermaid as a tragic figure. This is where the mermaid's story truly comes full circle, from being a symbol of temptation and peril to embodying themes of sacrifice, yearning, and unrequited love. Imagine the setting: a windswept cliff at twilight, where the waves crash against the rocks far below, and a soft voice echoes on the breeze. It's the voice of a mermaid, gentle yet haunting, singing a song of longing, a song that speaks of love and loss, of worlds that cannot be bridged. The tragic mermaid is a recurring motif, especially in literature, where the idea of an unattainable love that spans two worlds, has long been a source of deep emotional resonance. This is best exemplified in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, a tale that redefined the way mermaids were viewed forever. In Anderson's version, the mermaid, with her otherworldly beauty, is willing to sacrifice everything, her voice, her tale, her very identity, just to be with the human prince she loves. Yet in the end, her sacrifice is in vain, and the tale ends not with a union, but with the mermaid's transformation into sea foam, a symbol of her dreams and desires dissipating into nothingness. It's a heartbreaking conclusion, one that underscores the mermaid's position as an outsider. In her world, she is too human to truly belong to the sea, yet too otherworldly to ever fully integrate into the human world. The tension between these two realms is what gives the mermaid myth its tragic weight. The mermaid, for all her beauty and grace, is forever separated from the life she desires. Historians and literary critics still explore how the tragic mermaid myth taps into universal themes of longing, sacrifice, and the unattainable. This theme of sacrifice and unattainable love can also be found in other cultural representations of the mermaid. Take, for instance, the stories of mermaids from the British Isles, particularly in the folklore of the Scottish and Irish coasts. These mermaids, while still imbued with beauty and mystery, are often depicted as yearning for something that is just out of reach. In one tale, a mermaid falls in love with a mortal man, only to find that her love is doomed. She is forced to return to the sea, unable to bridge the gap between her world and his. This type of story, where the mermaid's beauty and allure are matched only by the sorrow of her separation from the human world, echoes the themes of isolation and sacrifice that run through much of mermaid lore. It's also interesting to note that, in some cultures, mermaids aren't always seen as tragic figures. In certain African and Caribbean traditions, for example, the mermaid takes on a more complex role, embodying both fertility and destruction. These mermaids, often tied to water spirits or deities, hold immense power that can be used for both good and ill. However, even in these more empowering depictions, there remains an element of tragedy. The mermaid is often caught between two worlds, neither fully belonging to the human world nor to the realm of the sea. In this sense, the mermaid's dual nature, her beauty and her danger, her love and her isolation, remains a powerful symbol of the complexities of the human experience. Historians continue to argue whether the mermaid's tragic nature is an inherent aspect of her myth, or whether it was shaped over time by cultural shifts and the changing roles of women in society. Some scholars suggest that the tragic mermaid represents the tension between the idealization of women and the societal constraints placed upon them. The mermaid, with her beauty and grace, symbolizes a kind of unattainable perfection, while her ultimate sacrifice underscores the limitations placed on women who long for a life that is just out of reach. In this way, the mermaid myth may have reflected the frustrations of medieval and Renaissance societies, where women were often constrained by strict gender roles and expectations. However, as we look toward the more modern interpretations of mermaids, we see that the tragic element of their story isn't always as central. In contemporary retellings, mermaids are sometimes depicted as figures of empowerment and strength, overcoming their challenges and finding their own paths. This modern shift reflects changing attitudes toward gender, autonomy, and self-determination. Yet even in these modern stories, the idea of the mermaid's tragic nature is never fully abandoned. Instead, it is reimagined, with the mermaid's journey often representing the struggle between individual desires and societal expectations. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the mermaid's tragedy is the way it speaks to the universal human experience of longing. Longing for something that is out of reach, whether it's love, freedom, or transcendence. The mermaid's sacrifice, her yearning, and her eventual dissolution into the sea are all metaphors for the human condition. Like the mermaid, we all long for something that feels just beyond our grasp, whether it's a dream, a goal, or a connection. And in that longing, we often experience both beauty and pain, joy and sorrow. As you settle into bed tonight, think about the mermaid's journey. She is a figure of both desire and loss, beauty and sacrifice. She represents the tension between the known and the unknown, the human and the divine, the attainable and the unattainable. In this way, the mermaid is not just a myth or a symbol. She is a reflection of the complexities of the human experience, a reminder that even in our deepest longing, we find both beauty and tragedy. As we draw near the final chapter of our mermaid journey, it's important to take a moment to reflect on the deeper meaning behind this myth, both the historical and the personal. From ancient cultures to medieval superstitions, from the romanticized beauty of the Renaissance to the empowered, independent figures of modern culture, the mermaid myth has lived through centuries, evolving in ways that reveal not just societal shifts, but the enduring themes that resonate across time. Now, as we rest in the quiet of the night, it's time to reflect on how the mermaid, at her core, represents the eternal human quest for understanding, transformation, and connection. Picture yourself standing once again on the shores of the sea, under the gentle light of the moon. The sound of the waves whispers in the distance, like a distant lullaby. In the quiet of the night, it's almost as if the mermaid might appear from the depths, a symbol of the mysteries that have captivated humanity for thousands of years. As you watch the sea, you realize that the mermaid, this elusive, mythical creature, embodies much more than just a story. She represents the longing for something beyond the surface, a desire to explore, to connect, and to transcend. In the medieval world, the mermaid was a creature of paradox, a seductive siren, yet a dangerous figure who could lead sailors to their doom. She was a symbol of the unknown, embodying the mysteries of the sea that humans could never fully understand. As time passed, she shifted from a symbol of temptation to a figure of tragedy and sacrifice, and eventually, into the empowering symbol we know today. The mermaid has always been a metaphor for human desires, whether for love, freedom, or transcendence, and her evolution reflects our own changing understanding of the world and ourselves. Throughout history, the mermaid has represented the tension between the known and the unknown, between reality and myth, between the constraints of human existence and the dream of something greater. She is a creature who lives between two worlds, the human and the supernatural, the land and the sea, and that duality has made her an enduring symbol of the complexities of human experience. The mermaid is both beautiful and dangerous, alluring yet tragic, representing the ways in which we all grapple with the mysteries of existence. And even today, in a world that is increasingly scientific, rational, and logical, the mermaid still captivates us. She remains a symbol of the mysteries we can never fully understand, of the beauty and danger of the unknown. In an era where we can chart the depths of the ocean and explore distant galaxies, the mermaid reminds us that there will always be mysteries just beyond our reach, forces of nature, emotions, and desires that defy complete understanding. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the mermaid myth is the way she reflects humanity's eternal desire to transcend the boundaries of our own existence. Whether in medieval tales of love and sacrifice or in modern depictions of freedom and environmental activism, The mermaid represents our longing to break free from the constraints of the world we know, to explore new horizons, and to become something more than what we are. She is a figure of transformation, not just physical, but spiritual, emotional, and psychological. In the same way that the mermaid herself is a creature who navigates two worlds, we too are constantly navigating between different realms, the physical and the emotional, the known and the unknown, the earthly and the spiritual. The mermaid's journey, then, is not just a myth. It is a reflection of our own journeys, our own struggles to find meaning, connection, and purpose. She embodies the yearning to reach beyond ourselves and to discover something greater, whether it's love, freedom, or a deeper understanding of the world. As you lie back and close your eyes tonight, think about the mermaid's timeless journey. From the depths of the sea to the shores of human imagination, her story is a reflection of the human spirit, always searching, always longing, always evolving. In her beauty and her danger, in her allure and her sacrifice, the mermaid represents the complexities of life itself and the endless quest to understand, to transform, and to transcend. Now let the quiet of the night embrace you as the mermaid's song fades into the distance and you drift off to sleep. The mysteries of the sea, like the mysteries of the human heart, will always remain, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be understood. And just like the mermaid, we too will continue our own journey, moving between worlds, reaching for something greater, and forever seeking the depths of life's endless ocean.